to the pièce de résistance, a really wonderful arrangement of the Nutcracker suite, of course, written originally as a ballet by Tchaikovsky. He then sort of turned it into an orchestral suite. But Tchaikovsky wrote this, one of the last pieces he wrote in his life. It came out in 1892 and was a pretty dismal failure when it came out. And he would die a year later thinking that it was a complete flop, his Nutcracker ballet. And one of his colleagues at the Moscow Conservatory by named Edward Longer thought it was a fantastic work, but he was very worried that once Tchaikovsky died, this music would be lost, and there would be no ballet, there would be no orchestra that would play it. So at that time, everybody had a piano, and the way to get music out there were no recordings, would be to write it as a four-hand piano arrangement. So we have four-hand piano arrangements of Beethoven's symphonies and all of these symphonies, a wonderful way that people could get this music. And so he arranged this work for four-hand piano really as a way to make sure this piece stayed alive. Now, ultimately, people came and realized what a great ballet the Nutcracker is, and now it's done all the time. But Tchaikovsky didn't think it was a success when he was alive. Now, Tchaikovsky was born in 1840. He's very near and dear to my heart. Many of you know I dropped out of law school. Tchaikovsky went to law school, but he hated it just as much as I did. He finished it, but did not want to be a lawyer. And it happened that just when he graduated in 1862, a new school opened up in Russia, the St. Petersburg Conservatory, the first of its kind. There was no training ground for musicians up until that point. There wasn't even a category of profession as a musician if you were in Russia. But Anton Rubinstein had gone to the conservatories in Germany, seen the great training they were providing, and so he brought a lot of these German professors to St. Petersburg, opened this conservatory, and really within 20, 30 years, the Russian conservatories, the St. Petersburg and Moscow conservatories, became kind of the breeding grounds of many of the great composers and violinists and pianists. They really rose up quite fast. Tchaikovsky was in that first class of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and he was so good that when he graduated 3 years later, they hired him to be the composition teacher at the new Moscow Conservatory that opened up. And he taught for about 10 years there. He never loved teaching. He really just wanted to spend his time composing, but he needed to have the money that came with teaching. Now, everything came to a head in 1876. One of his students, a woman by the name of Antonina Milyakova, fell madly in love with Tchaikovsky and threatened to kill herself if she didn't get married to him. Now, Tchaikovsky was gay and did not want to marry this woman, but he was working on an opera, Eugene Onegin, and if you know that opera, in that opera, a man sort of callously rejects this woman, and some really bad things happen afterwards. And so he thought, well, maybe I could just marry her and see how it goes. They get married. 3 weeks later, he tried to kill himself. Was not successful, but that was a marriage doomed from the start. They actually never officially got divorced. He paid her money throughout the rest of his life. She ended up the last 10 or 15 years of her life in an insane asylum, so there's a great movie to be made about Antonina Milyakova. But for our purposes, he went into a pretty deep depression at that time, wasn't sure what was next. And just at the bottom of this, he gets this letter from a woman named Nadezhda von Metz. She was a wealthy countess who had heard a lot of Tchaikovsky's music and loved it. She made him this offer, basically said, I will pay you a yearly stipend that's much more than you're making as a teacher so that you can just compose great music. And she only had two stipulations. One was that she wanted him to write monthly letters to her about the creative process. She really wanted to get inside the brain of a composer, of a creator. What did it take to get inspired to write this music? And because of that, we have amazing letters that Tchaikovsky writes about his music and the powers and the process that came to make it. And some wonderful quotes. She once asked him, how do you get inspired to do this? And he wrote back, inspiration is a guest that does not willingly visit the lazy. So he really understood that it was a process. He had to sit down every day and try to work. He also said, I sit down to the piano regularly at 9 o'clock in the morning, and Mesdames les Muses have learned to be on time for that rendezvous. He wrote some of the most beautiful melodies of all time. He said once, where the heart does not enter, there can be no music. But he still was depressed a lot of his life. One of his sad quotes, he said, to regret the past, to hope in the future, and never to be satisfied with the present. That is what I spend my whole life doing. Truly, there would be reason to go mad were it not for music. The other nice thing we get in these letters, we hear some of his thoughts about other composers, which is not always very nice. He went to see the Ring Cycle by Wagner, which lasts way too long, 4 days of torture, and he said, "After the last notes of Götterdämmerung, I felt as though I had been let out of prison," which is and he also did not like Brahms, and he wrote once to the Countess, he said, "I have just played over the music of that scoundrel Brahms. What a giftless bastard he is! It annoys me that this self-inflated mediocrity is hailed as a genius." Now, the other stipulation that she had was that they could never meet in person. And I'm not sure why that came about, but as far as we know, she paid him about 15 years of salary, and they never crossed paths. She just wanted to have a letter sort of getting from him, but not meeting in person. Sadly, she stopped sending money in 1892, just a year before he dies, and that might have contributed to a lot of his depression at the end of his life. He wasn't sure where the money was going to come from, although he was doing quite well by that time. In fact, the Nutcracker, which he wrote in 1892, a lot of the ideas came to him while he was on a boat coming to the United States, because in 1891, Carnegie Hall opened here, and they invited Tchaikovsky to be the opening night conductor of Carnegie Hall. So he came over to New York on that boat. He said he had many of the great ideas that would become the Nutcracker, and he loved being in New York. He wrote back to his brother, "I was accorded a very warm welcome here, with the local papers all running my portraits and writing stories about me. It looks like I'm even more popular here than I am in Europe. I'm a big shot here, I really am. There are things people in Moscow have hardly heard about, while here in America they're played and written about several times a year. For example, my overture to Hamlet, which they never once played in Moscow, is very well known in America. These Americans are absolutely amazing. Their sincerity, generosity, friendliness, and desire to please are absolutely out of this world. Nowhere but in Russia have I ever seen so much love for foreigners. The American way of life is really good for me." And he contemplated staying here, spending a couple more years, but he ends up going back, has this Nutcracker that's kind of a failure, and then in 1893, there's a large cholera epidemic that spreads all through Europe, but especially in Russia. He ends up drinking some unboiled water and dies, sadly, at the age of 53. But we are thankful that the Nutcracker is now heard all the time, and that we have this wonderful four-hand arrangement of the Nutcracker suite.